And perhaps I should do a little recap about what happened before. Remember the first webinar, we were just setting the concept, defining many different kinds of decoupling and clarifying concept and definitions. Last webinar, we reviewed the available evidence for the type of decoupling we defined in the first webinar, which is, permanent, total, absolute, sufficient, fast enough decoupling. And basically, I really like this cartoon, which I found on Twitter. I think it sums it all. So we've reviewed the evidence and we ended up concluding not only after the evidence we saw in the Decoupling Debunked report, but also after, and especially after the exhaustive review of literature by Abel and his colleague in June 2020, that there's been no empirical evidence for the type of decoupling that we hear about in green growth discourses. And at this point, I think we've already moved in the debate, because if you were to just have this discussion 10 years ago, people will just bicker, no, but look, I've got my numbers and I've seen decoupling somewhere in Switzerland, and look, you just have the wrong numbers. Now I think the debate has moved. We agree that the type of decoupling we want has never occurred in history in the past. But some people will then tell you, well, then we just need to work harder. We need to accelerate. We need to do this and that, and we will make decoupling happen in the future. And that's going to be the topic of today's webinar. That's the tweet I published straight after the report was out. And that's the way we framed it in the report, is to list 7 obstacles to decoupling and green growth, to kind of argue that in order for decoupling and green growth to happen against historical evidence, it will have to demonstrate that it can overcome these 7 obstacles. So this was the summer of 2019. I've managed, I think now, and you'll tell me what you think about it, to cut 2 of these obstacles and have it as 5, because I've realized 2 of them really had to do with the way we measure decoupling. So for example, cost shifting, in the way that you can export your pollutions is not, it is an obstacle to decoupling, but it really has to do with the way we measure it. So here we're not going to deal with this. We're going to deal with 5 obstacles, which I will just start to summarize now. The first one is rising energy expenditures. So to explain that one, we first need to understand that without energy, you don't have an economy. Very simply. And of course, economists will come at you and be like, oh, but in France, for example, the energy sector is only 1.8% of GDP. It's almost nothing. They will also tell you that agriculture is nothing. It's only 1.6% of GDP. Who cares? Try not to eat and you'll see who cares. Try to do anything without energy and you will realize that any economic activity you can think of requires some energy. That is one of my favorite quotes from a Steve Keen article. And I think it makes the case that if you cannot find an abundant source of energy, you cannot ensure continued production. If you want to grow production, you need to grow the availability of energy. And some people can say that energy is plentiful, and you can see numbers about all the solar energy that is hitting the earth, but that's not really the problem. The problem is not all the energy that is out there, it is our ability to get that energy. And the way we get that energy historically follows a rule of thumb in economics that we call the low-hanging fruit. So it's not scientific, but usually, you know, it is assumed that when you're trying to overcome a problem, well, you're going to go for the easiest, cheapest options first. If you're looking for oil, you're going to start drilling it, you know, a few kilometers away from where you live, just, you know, shallow and cheap. You're not going to go to the polar ice cap to drill it, you know, in kilometers under the sea in a very difficult environment. So, but of course, as the cheap and easy to access forms of energy run out, it gets more and more relatively hard, dangerous, and expensive to access energy. And there's a way to measure how difficult it is to get energy. And that is the concept of EROI, energy returns on energy invested. So think of oil, for example. EROI would be the ratio between the number of barrels of oil you need to invest into extracting oil. So let's say you need 1 barrel of oil to extract 5 barrels of oil. That will be your EROI ratio. You sacrifice 1 barrel in order to get 5 barrels. Same thing if you want to produce a solar panel, you will need some energy to extract the minerals, to manufacture them together. And then this solar panel will give you electricity for, you know, 30 years where it works. So you can compare these two amounts of energy and that gives you a ratio. So now, if that ratio goes down, it means you need to sacrifice more and more energy in the process of extracting energy. So here we can make the difference between energy price and energy cost. Here we're not talking about the price of energy in euros or dollars. We're talking about the cost of energy in energy terms. That's very important when we're doing ecological economics, because we want to make sure we're dealing with the physical quantity here. So to say it in a different way, the lower the EROI is, so remember, if it's low, the more energy you need to extract a specific quantity of energy, the more difficult it will be to decouple. Because every time you want to grow your economy, you want to do a new economic activity, you will need energy, extra energy. And to get that extra energy, you will need to sacrifice a lot of energy to get it. So here we can see that economies that are just at the beginning, you know, they can have very fast rates of growth because, you know, you sacrifice 1 barrel of oil and then you can get 50 barrels of oil out of that. So a lot of available energy. But the more difficult you get in accessing energy, then the lower is your growth potential. And here I've put you, that's the problem, EROI or decreasing. Not only EROIs concerning fossil fuels, but also when we switch from, let's say, coal, gas, and oil to fossil derivatives, shale gas, shale oil, Arctic oil, deep sea oil, all of these, they have lower EROI because they are more difficult, complex, and expensive to access. Imagine drilling, you know, in deep sea versus drilling in Texas easily in the field. Other problem, if you look at the EROI of renewable energy, you realize that they're way lower than the EROI of fossil fuel. This is telling us that an economy fully powered by renewable energy has a lesser growth potential than one powered by fossil fuel, because you need to sacrifice a big part of available energy just to maintain the energetic infrastructure of that economy. And when we have the logic of EROI, we can also apply it to minerals. Numbers tell us the same thing. It is getting more and more difficult to extract minerals. It matters because, of course, if you want to build an energy infrastructure, you will need minerals. So same problem here. If you want to build an energy infrastructure that is renewable, it takes more minerals than fossil fuel energy. 1 kilowatt hour of renewable energy requires 10 times more mineral than 1 kilowatt hour of fossil fuels. So here you can think like it's not only an energy matter. Here we are also limited by the availability of minerals. And so even an economy that will be powered 100% by renewable energy, it could not grow forever, because every time it would like to expand its infrastructure, you would need to find the new minerals to build that, and it would get increasingly difficult to get the minerals. So every time I say increasingly difficult, you need to hear limits to growth. You need to hear making decoupling less and less likely. Limit number one, that's already a difficult one to overcome. And since I published the report in 2019, I've received a lot of people have contacted me to discuss the report, but I've not received, nobody has picked up the challenge of showing me how these limits could be overcome. So this can be another way of calling anyone that really think that decoupling is possible to show me how we are going to overcome that obstacle of rising energy expenditure. That is only 1 out of 5. Let's go into the second one now. I'm so happy to be able to do this, because I'm finally going to be able to make public a joke I made a few years ago. So I hope you're ready for this. Why are ecological economists so afraid of trampolines? Answer is rebound effects. If you didn't find it funny, you will after understanding what a rebound effect is. So let's start from this. People will tell you we can green growth with efficiency improvements. So new technology that allow you, to have a more fuel efficient car and all of this. The problem is that we have what is often referred to as Jevons paradox. After Stanley Jevons writing the coal question, noticing that actually as machines were getting more and more efficient, using less and less coal, it did not reduce the overall consumption of coal in the economy. It actually accelerated it, because it allowed more people to build these machines and to use it. It made coal cheaper, and so on. So the Jevons paradox now is something we call rebound effect. And here you have to bear with me. A rebound is a situation where a more efficient use of a resource leads to using it more intensively. That's what it is in general. This is why we call it a rebound. But now it can be of many different kinds. Let's start to divide microeconomic rebound to macroeconomic rebound. So on the upper side, you can see the micro level. Direct rebound is when you have an efficiency gain and it's reinvested as more consumption of the same thing. So imagine you buy a new car, and of course it consumes less fuel than your old car, but just because it consumes less fuel and so it's cheaper to drive, you will drive it more often. And so perhaps, let's say the efficiency improvement of having a better car is going to rebound into a bit more emissions than expected because of that change of behavior. Same thing on the production side. This is a direct rebound, but this can be also an indirect rebound. Same thing, let's imagine you're buying the new car and you're saving money on fuel because your car is so fuel efficient. Or maybe even, it's an electric car, so you don't have to pay for gas anymore. So you're saving a lot of money. And with that money in your bank account, you decide to, fly somewhere for the holiday. So here you see the efficiency gain in the car sector allowed you to reduce emissions in transport, but that saving is going to be reallocated in the economy somewhere else in aviation. So that's the case of indirect rebound. Same thing if you leave that bank account, that money in the bank account, and then the bank is investing the money into extractive industries. Same thing, the savings are circulating into the economy. Indirect microeconomic rebound. That's one category. The second category is macroeconomic rebound, having to do with the way the economy is being structured. So, you could say that if you have more fuel efficient cars, it's great, because then maybe people that would have been, it's great. You have more fuel efficient cars, but this reinforces the car as an hegemonic mode of transportation. Let's say that people that would have decided between either taking public transport or the bike or a car will say, oh, I'll take the car because it's so fuel efficient. And so if many people do so, you will see there will be a rebound. So more emissions that would have happened if that efficiency gains had not happened in the first place. And of course, this has to do with many different things, the way you structure an economy, price, regulations, everything really, when we talk of the rebound effect, has to do with the way your economy, the architecture of your economy is laid out. And this, in a capitalist economy, where you have so-called the general purpose currency, so with euros or dollars, you can buy whatever you want everywhere in the economy, you tend to see money being saved up by efficiency gains and resources being saved up by efficiency gains being reallocated somewhere else in the economy. Well, that's in a growth economy, of course, where the goal is to maximize profits, income, and GDP. You know, unused resources are not just staying there. If you're just managing to save some fuel, not just, oh, just let's be happy leaving it in nature. No, it's going to be used by someone else at some point to increase their income, profit, or GDP. Oh, something else. Your rebound can be either partial or total. It is partial if there's still some saving in the end. So let's say you buy a new car and it's, you know, more fuel efficient, let's say 50%, you save 50% fuel, and you drive it a tiny bit more. So then there will be a partial rebound in the sense of, you know, you will not save as much fuel as if you would have just drove it exactly the same way as before. You drive it a bit more, so it increased, but not as much as to overcompensate for the efficiency gain. That second situation will be called a total rebound. So let's say, you know, your car consumes twice, 50% less, but you drive it like 6 times more. So then, of course, your absolute emissions are going to increase. And then you could say that that efficiency gain has backfired. It has become total. So that efficiency gains actually worsen the situation. I'm going to keep on this, just a nice study to show that every single time, you know, we manage to get efficiency on certain materials, it does not phase them out from the economy slowly. Actually, most of them just are seeing their use being increased, except when they are banned for other reasons. But then I'm going to give you an example, which is 5G. I like the example of 5G because it's one of the arguments is that the 5G infrastructure is more energy efficient than the 4G. The antennas, the individual antennas, they consume less. But you could say it can rebound if the volume of online activity increases. I mean, the volume has been multiplied by 10 between 2014 and 2019. So if you switch to 5G, and that means like you can do a lot more things online, and that boosts, you know, the volumes of things being exchanged online, you save a bit of a few percent through, you know, more through the efficiency gains, but this is completely overcompensated by the increase in volume. So that will be a total rebound. Plus, you could say, well, most of the phones we have today cannot receive for 5G. So in order to have this, you would need to actually everyone to change their phones. We know that one phone, you know, emits 50 kilograms of CO2 and roughly requires 70 kilograms of materials. So you can see as well that this is an indirect part of the footprint of 5G that is not taken into account if you're just looking at the energy efficiency of the antenna. And then you could also look at the macroeconomic effect, being like, who's going to make money out of the introduction of 5G? And where's that money being spent? What kind of activity are going to be allowed by 5G? Just an example, you know, if 5G allows you to have more invasive advertisements, and that this leads to, you know, more consumption of material product, that can be an example of rebound. So that's the conclusion here. Same thing as the first limit. The more rebound effect you have, the more difficult it is to decouple. If the rebound effect are partial, it is only slowing down your decoupling. If they are total, actually it can cancel it. This limit is important to me because if you try to argue that theoretically, not even in terms of time or what, it is impossible to decouple GDP from economic growth, I think I would go for this limit and explain that within the capitalist economy, any used resource will always rebound if there is a way of making money out of it. So that's usually the argument I use when I try to show that in order to achieve ecological sustainability, we need to reform the economy rather than just decreasing at the margin what we do in the current economic architecture. Limit number 3 has to do with the service sector. Some people say we can green growth by growing the service sector. And indeed, I mean, if you look at numbers, services are less ecologically intensive than industrial activities. But here we see a few problems. First, we would need to have absolute deindustrialization. So obviously it doesn't work if you're just added, you're just service activities, they come on top of industrial ones. From webinar 1, we remember that this would lead to what I've called GDP-driven relative decoupling. You have the same amount of industrial activities, but then more service activities coming on top. And so, of course, the average ecological intensity of every euro in your economy is getting less, but there is no decrease of pressures overall. The problem is that most high-income economies have already deindustrialized to the maximum they could do so. So most of them have reached the theoretical point where you have roughly 70% of your GDP is made of services, and everything else that is not services is things that you cannot dematerialize. I mean, think of transport, industry, agriculture, construction, the energy sector, waste management. Like by definition, these, you just cannot transform them into pure services. So if you argue that we want to have absolute deindustrialization, then that doesn't work because there's no potential more deindustrialization to do. And then of course we could look at like what has been the effect of previous deindustrialization. Has this achieved absolute decoupling? Well, if you've been attentive to webinar 2, you know that the answer to that is no. So there's even less chances in the future that we decouple through deindustrialization. There is another reason why the service sector cannot green growth, and that the fact that services are linked to other sectors. I mean, you buy a Netflix account with a computer, not instead of a computer. You listen music to a device, even, when you go and have a massage, I mean, the building must be constructed, it must be heated, it must be lit. Same thing for the internet, all the energy, the cables, the pipe, the data center. Every service somehow is connected to a material basis. And so we cannot say, like often people point to Amazon and say, oh, look at all the profits that Amazon is making online. But I mean, every time something is being delivered through an Amazon delivery truck, this is not an online activity. This is real fuel being burned, emitting real CO2. There's this study I quite like that's been looking at the footprint of the music industry. And what it has found is, the finding was quite astonishing, is they argue that the music industry is more polluting today than it ever was. So the study runs from the 70s to 2016 and shows that we went from the global footprint of the music industry was 140 million kilos of CO2 in 1977, then went up to 157 in 2000, and then to in between 200 and 300 in 2016. So here you can see, music is being dematerialized, but not really, only in appearance, because music on the internet is on the internet, and we need the energy, the pipe, the data center, and all of this. And here I'm not even taking into account the indirect rebound effect, linked with the people that are just, making money out of music, and where that saves energy is going. But we'll come back to this. Another example I like is Bitcoin. Bitcoin is a cryptocurrency. And so some people use this as an example to show that Bitcoin is the perfect example of a immaterial value, because it exists completely out of nature. But people that have done studies, looked into the footprint of Bitcoin, have found that it actually consumes 7 times more energy than YouTube. And I found this number, which is enough to boil all the cattle in Britain for 16 years. So that's an annual consumption of electricity from Bitcoin. And another study, that's the one I'm citing here, has found that Bitcoin emits every year as much carbon as Sweden. So here that shows you that Bitcoin, through the way the coin are mined, and the energy it takes to cool down the data center and to run the entire infrastructure, is not immaterial at all. So now let's add in the rebound effect. Facebook, another good example of supposedly immaterial value creating. But think about this. I mean, when you go on Facebook, most of the ads, they are just for material product. You have a lot of traveling, plane ads, buying clothing, SUVs, and whatever else. So the money that Facebook makes through advertisements is for advertisement for material product. So, well, if brands did not manage to increase sales by using advertisement on Facebook, I think they would not be paying money to do so. So we can fairly assume that the advertisement they use on Facebook is helping them to sell more. If that is so, the value being created on Facebook is directly linked, well, not directly, indirectly, is not on the footprint of Facebook as a company, which looks immaterial, but it's a derivative of their activity. Then we can also think of, all the salaries being paid at Facebook, all the bonuses, and, the money given to shareholders. Where's that going to go? Well, part of it is going to be spent on fuel, on travels, on constructed houses, on material things. And same thing for the money being invested. Some of it is going to be invested in, further extraction of fossil fuels and minerals. So here, when we look at it from a holistic macroeconomic perspective, we realize that there is no such thing as an immaterial service economy. The service economy functions within a broader biophysical economy, and can only exist on top of this economy. This is also why, and here a little comment as to the possibility of having, theoretical decoupling forever, even if your economy was just fully made of service, assuming no one eats and eat and everything else. Even if you were to expand this, I mean, somehow, even if it's just very frugal, the fact that you still need to use energy and materials, then you would need to increase it. So somehow that shows to me that decoupling is always theoretically temporary. And we'll come back to this when we discuss the technology. But this is my favorite example, and I've been trying to calculate this for my book. I don't have a final number yet, but you see many people play this on their TV when they don't have an actual fire. And I wanted to compare what was the carbon footprint of a real fire compared to the carbon footprint of playing a fire on YouTube. But now, from what I've said before, we know that actually that video and watching that video is emitting carbon into the atmosphere. Let me switch to limit number 4. Recycling. So the concept of circular economy that is often associated to green economy and green growth. And the idea here is of course, if you have an economy that is extracting a lot of resources and emitting a lot of pollutions in nature, well, that's problematic. You're going to have limits to growth. But if you manage to extract resources, not in ecosystems, but in the waste you have already produced, and if instead of emitting waste actually and pollutions, you manage to reuse them in the economic circle, perhaps you could create some infinite loops of value creation. That is at least the theory of circular economy. There are three reasons why that story does not hold. The first family of reasons, let's say, has to do with practical problems concerning recycling. Let's start with that one. You cannot recycle everything. Here's one number. Out of 100 billion tons of resource extracted globally in 2017, you had 1/5 of that just cannot be recovered because it's been burned, dissipated, and all of this. Then certain products are very hard to recycle. This is the case for a smartphone. I was quite surprised to realize that even one of the most recyclable smartphone, the Fairphone, only 30% of its material can be effectively recycled. When you broaden the reach and you look at e-waste in general, I mean, you see that a small part of it is recycled, and the most problematic aspect is that increases in the recyclability of e-waste is not going very fast. So we're not getting incredibly better at recycling. I could also mention, I mean, here that's effective recycling, but anything that you can recycle in theory is not going to be recyclable in practice because perhaps it's too expensive. I mean, think about single-use plastics, which we recycle at a rate of only between 10 and 15%. What's most shocking is that number of recycling only 10 to 15% of single-use plastics has been the same for the last 30 years. So it's just not been increasing because there's just no value to be derived in recycling single-use plastics. Another number I found is out of 130 billion tons of plastic waste in 2019, 35% were burnt, 31% were buried, and 19% thrown in nature. So you can see for these categories of goods, we're still very much within a linear economy. And of course, to overcome this, you will also need to go against planned obsolescence. So you would need recycling rates to increase faster than planned obsolescence, which determine the rate at which you're throwing away your product. And in a capitalist economy, I think there is more money to be made in planned obsolescence and inciting more consumption than there is in recycling these materials. And so far, when we're looking at different investments, we see that a lot of money is getting into inciting consumption through planned obsolescence, and very little money is getting into increasing recycling abilities. But let's assume that you can recycle 100% of all waste. And you can do so without using any energy to do so. So even if you can do this, your growth potential would be limited to, of course, the amount of material that you have. That's the analogy I used in Decoupling Debunked to show that an economy cannot be both circular and growing, because at the end of 1 year, you've produced a certain amount of waste that you can reuse. Let's assume again, we can use 100% of that. You can reuse 100%, but you cannot use 200%. It's not possible. You cannot create waste that does not exist. In the same way that the snake, could not make his new skin out of the old one, or my new analogy that you could not build. Even if you increase recycling to 100%, you cannot build a second international space station out of the waste of the first international space station. That's just, physically impossible. What makes this even more complicated is that many materials stay in the economy for a long time. I mean, think about construction materials or materials stuck in a car that you use for 15 years or in roads. And so they become available like decades after. So if you were to start a circular economy today and still want to grow your economy, you would also be limited by the delay that it takes to render these materials available again. Third limit has to do with thermodynamics. And here, before I assume that it doesn't take any energy to recycle, but that's not true. If you want to recycle something, it takes time and effort. So energy recycling is an economic activity like any other, and so it fits within our first limit. It needs energy. The more you want to recycle, the more energy you need. And actually, the recycling infrastructure also need materials, not only to capture the energy it uses, but just to recycle itself. Problem, we get back to limit number one. So if you want to increase your recycling capacity infinitely, you would need to have an infinite increasing access to energy, which you don't because of limit number one. Same thing for materials. A larger problem has to do with the physical structure of these materials you're trying to recycle. And perhaps you've heard of the term downcycling. This is the logo of downcycling in the background. The fact if you try to recycle paper, you cannot start from normal paper and get normal paper again. You get to lower grades of paper. You can maybe recycle it, I think, up to 6 times, then it cannot be paper anymore. Same thing for plastic bottles. You cannot recycle them into perfect plastic bottles again. Then it becomes like lower grade plastic to be used in different things. So there are just some thermodynamic having to do with entropy, thermodynamic limits to how many cycles of recycling you can do. The take-home message here through this different limits I've been talking about is that it's great to try to circularize the economy, and any sustainable economy must be as circular as possible. But it is naive to think that we can have both a circular and growing economy. I quite like the proposal of what some have called a spiral economy. So instead of being circular and growing, it's circular and degrowing. So I think here, but that's not part of green growth and decoupling, that's part of the degrowth agenda. It will be easier to circularize the economy if you were to, at the same time, decrease the volume of things you produce and you consume. But as of what I've presented here, limits to recycling represent another, that's our fourth, limit to decoupling and green growth. Now we have one more, and that is the big one. That's the joker card you've heard in every single green growth discussion. I'm sure every single one of you have been in this argument. And that's actually the one they're going to use in all the other limits. They're going to be, oh, rising energy expenditure, no problem. We'll innovate our way out of this. Oh, recycling, no problem. We'll invent your way to recycle. So anything every time falls back to technology in a always very vaguely defined as technological progress, innovation. So let's dive a bit into this. My first point here is that not all innovation is helping us to green growth. Innovations is a very general process through which we collectively try to solve problems. And if you look at patent, you will see certain innovations that are actually making the situation worse. We'll see, for example, 5G through Rebound Effect is increasing our overall footprint, but also the invention of hydraulic fracturing that has allowed some shale oil extraction, or discovery of new ways of deep sea mining that did not exist before is allowing for some new forms of environmental degradations. Industrial fishing trawlers that did not exist before. That's innovation. Space expansion, that's innovation. Very heavy footprint. very little result for eco-innovations. Bitcoin, invented in 2008, and all the cryptocurrencies, that's innovation, but that's just making it more difficult to decouple. SUVs, not only invented as an object, but invented also as a car culture, now being sold as in certain countries, as you know, there are more SUVs being sold in the US than non-SUVs. So that is making it harder for an economy to decouple. I'm thinking of sort of chemicals, toxic product, you know, spam techniques, advertising on the internet, data harvesting, pesticides. So first, we need to realize that part of innovation, people don't innovate out of the pleasure of innovating. That's part that's framed structurally by what the economy is set on doing. And today we realize that, well, many people that innovate are part of companies that innovate in order to make money. And solving the climate crisis is not the best way to make money today. Exploiting the environment is a more lucrative activity. And so therefore we see a lot of innovations enabling us to do that. I saw this the other day, sorry, it's in French, but you know, that was on the Twitter homepage, declaring like, bravo, you know, we've finally managed to have the first electronic credit card transaction in space. You know, I don't even want to know how many years, how many engineers, how much energy and materials were required to do that very single thing that serves absolutely no purpose. So that's the type of innovation that is being loaded. So every single time we're having the discussions about innovation, saving the planet, I want to see what kind of innovation you're referring to. This study is rare because it has looked beyond the concept of innovation, but looked at patents themselves. What are they about? So they've been looking at all patents in the car industry between 1978 and 2005 in 80 countries. So it's a huge study. It's from 2016. And what they wanted to know, they were comparing how many patents on fossil cars there were compared to patents on electric cars. And as you can expect, you know, in the 70s, there were just almost no patent on electric cars. And as you know, time goes, there were more and more patents for electric cars. That's to be expected. But what they also realized that whatever the growth of patent in electric car was, there was always more patent in fossil cars, even today. So whatever the rate of growth of eco-innovations, dirty innovation was growing faster. So here it's no mystery then, and now we can of course be a bit more specific and look at why Norway has managed, you know, to get a majority of electric car in its fleet compared to a country like France and the US that has failed to do so. That has to do with regulation, the structuring of the economy, which again is, let's say, an argument for what I've been trying to argue, that we need to change the design of the economy. But here, I would like to see these studies being done for a lot of other technologies and look at the specific patent. Here, why have companies done so? I want to come back to something I already said. For-profit companies are trying to minimize cost of production. That's what they're legally structured to do. Today, labor and capital, so workers and machines, are the expensive factors of production because, you know, environmental costs are unpriced. Many countries don't have a carbon tax. If they have it, it's very low, so it's very cheap to pollute. So companies, of course, they want to innovate, find inventions to minimize the use of labor and capital. They don't really care in innovating in decreasing the amount of pollutions they have because it's currently very cheap, is not quite a problem. So as long as we don't change this, we cannot expect technological progress to solve the climate crisis. Second problem, innovation is not enough. You know, like innovation, if they are additive and not disruptive, they're just being added on top. So we need not only innovation, the invention of new technologies and protocols, but also ex-novation. So let's say the abandonment of certain technologies and social protocols. Best example is in the energy sector, where actually we've not seen an energy transition, we've seen an energy addition, where the renewable energies have grown, but they've grown on top of an increase in the use of fossil fuels. What we would need in order to decouple, we would need to phase out fossil fuels and have this being replaced by renewable energy. We've seen that with the old limits being considered, even that won't cut it. But here, that's what we would need, but we don't even have it because they are just so-called zombie technologies for social reasons. You know, people keep old cars they have because they can and it's cheap, and or because they don't have the means of doing otherwise. You have inertia in slow infrastructure. I mean, you build a plane that lasts for roughly 30 years, a car is 15 years, heating system are built to last around at least 20 years. So you see here, we have decades type of rhythm, whereas the IPCC tell us that addressing climate change and many other urgent environmental crises is a matter of years, not decades. So here there's also a mismatch between the rates of innovation that we're seeing, I mean, we're not seeing them, but the potential of them happening. And so then even both in practice and in theory here, the potential of technological change just kicking out and saving the days is very low. But let me bring to a third limit, which has to do with the speed. So I've seen that, okay, let's assume now that all innovation is eco-innovation. And let's assume that all innovation comes and, you know, disrupt and exnovate the old polluting industries. Then we would still need that speed of economic change to be matching with how much we want to reduce emissions. I'm not going to get into the calculus of that scenario from Team Jackson, but basically look at the two numbers. Is done a few simulations to show that the type of decrease in environmental pressure you get with the few eco-innovations we have is giving us, is very okay. I unmuted myself. So you hear me now? Yes. So the main point here is that the required speed of technological innovation we would need to have if everything else works perfectly is enormous compared to what we had in the past, which is problematic since innovations are slowing down. There's this study I quite like that has been studying American patents from 1970 to 2005. And what they show is that it's getting more and more expensive to innovate. That's not surprising. It's another case of low-hanging fruits. So at first, you know, you discover things quite easily without investing too much with a small team of researchers and quite fast. And then as you try to discover new medicine, new molecules and things like this, just it gets more expensive. You need more people, you need more time, you need more infrastructure. So here we also have a mismatch where we would need technological progress to increase very faster than it has in the past. But the problem is that we've already reached kind of peaks of innovations overall, and that are actually now marginally decreasing. And same thing for eco-innovations. I forgot to put it here, but I found a study looking at the rate of innovation concerning renewable energies, and they found the same type of decreasing marginal results applied to innovation, where it's more and more expensive to innovate when it comes to the type of solar panels you have, for example. So that the triple problem having to do with the technology joker card. Most innovations go against the objective of decreasing environmental pressures. The eco-innovations that arrive are often added on top of the pile and do not manage to disrupt the polluting technologies that already exist. And third problem, the speed of change is slow and slowing down, and definitely too slow to achieve the type of reduction we would like to see. So these were my 5 limits. Now, I've already overshot my time. I'm going to take a few minutes to conclude. For those of you that are interested into a few ideas in exploring the theoretical possibility of whether it is fundamentally impossible to decouple GDP from environmental pressures, I encourage you to read the last few pages of this paper by Jason Hickel and Yorgos Kallis, where they basically argue that, well, in theory, you can show anything. So you could build a theory that show you that it's possible to decouple in the same way that you could show a theory that it's impossible based on your assumptions. And they end up concluding that we should not waste too much time doing this, because that will be a purely abstract theoretical exercise. And that when we're talking about such a pressing issue, we must remain grounded in empirical reality. So I agree with them, but if you want to discuss this afterwards, I'll be happy to do so. Now let me conclude with this picture from last week at the COP, or I don't remember where it was, but you can see world leaders throwing coin into the fountain as a sign of good chance. And when I saw the picture, that reminded me that's precisely what green growth and decoupling is. It's an act of faith that goes against not only historical patterns, we've seen it in webinar 2, but also against theoretical explanations and against modeling results, which we've not talked too much about. But if you read Ecol and Kallis' paper, Is Green Growth Happening?, you will get a review of models and scenarios about green growth, and they're all quite not very optimistic about the possibility of having green growth in the future. But nonetheless, we keep trying and hope that it will work. I argue in Decoupling Debunked, and I still maintain here, that this is a dangerous strategy. What I think we should rather do, and this is in the conclusion of Decoupling Debunked, is follow a precautionary principle. To assume that somehow we will perhaps see some rates of decoupling, but we need to be realistic and pragmatic about how high this rate will be, and realizing that these will be enough to get us under planetary boundaries. We need to plan the extra work that, if we cannot green growth, is to reduce growth through a targeted reduction of the volume of production and consumption of certain goods and services. So that's basically the idea of degrowth. Today, if I had to bet my life on it, I think there's one risky strategy and one safe strategy. If today we decide to reduce production and consumption, and if in the future, for whatever reason, we manage somehow to find wonderful technologies and magic recycling, then we could, in theory, then start to produce and consume more. But as of now, as this has not been happening in the past, is not happening today, is not forecasted to happen in the future, I think the precautionary principle tells us that we should be careful and abandon the idea for high consuming, high income countries to continue growing forever. That's the hard to swallow pill. That's the controversial question. And that is what we can discuss now. So let's open the floor for questions, Dag.